Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. I'm Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker, and we're recording today on Thursday the 1st of May. So as always, if something happens radical in the next few days before we get this out, that's why we're not covering it. In this podcast, we try to unpack the key developments that are shaping maritime security and maritime issues in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So we'll get going. But before we do, what have you been up to this week or for the past week or so, Jen?
Well, look, I think we mentioned in our last episode that we are in the midst of an election in Australia, which will be over, thank God, on Saturday the 3rd of May.
You're not enjoying the adverts?
No.
And the text messages from Clive Palmer?
The trumpet of patriots. No, I'm not. So we are in the midst of an election. So I've been doing a lot, I guess, talking about Australia's place in the world and defence spending. So I was recently on an Insiders podcast. If you follow in Australia, you'll know Insiders with David Spears, with Professor Peter Dean, who was the co-author of our 2023 Defence Strategic Review. I've also had a piece out in the conversation about why AUKUS still matters and makes strategic sense, which got some interesting responses. But that was really in response to Albert Palazzo's piece in the conversation where he talked about the fact that we don't need ships or submarines anymore, we only need drones. So it's kind of a counter to that. And then last night I had the honour of giving a speech at the Australian Institute of International Affairs talking about what a maritime strategy for Australia would look like and the need to think more broadly about using all elements of national power, i.e. not bifurcating the idea of maritime strategy between civil maritime strategy and military maritime strategy, and somewhere in between, there's no mention of subsea cables. So talking about that, and I think that will be up on YouTube in the next day or two, so we will probably share a link to that on our YouTube. Richard, what have you been up to? You've been publishing too.
I've been doing some bits and pieces. I mentioned, I think, at the end of last week, we've been running here at UNSW Canberra, our little research group ran a survey, a public opinion survey on defence. And as soon as kind of the election got pushed back a little bit, it became obvious that we needed to try and get something out before the election, as is the kind of the pressure of these sort of things. So we had an interim report out, and I put out an article in The Conversation talking about some of the findings and how there's actually quite considerable public support for defence. But one of the key things that we sort of found out was that actually the public know very little about defence, what defence does, what the organisation kind of looks like. And in particular, given the election and given the focus, we were talking about defence spending and how actually public support for defence spending is not that great. So roughly 33% of those surveyed thought that the ADF, the government should spend more money on the ADF. And even amongst Liberal voters, those who are perhaps seen as being most likely to support defence spending, still only 44% of Liberal voters were in favour of greater spending on defence. So that was one of the things that I've been doing. And I've also got an article that hopefully will be out either today or tomorrow in Loe's The Interpreter, talking about cables. And kind of why cables are potentially an asset as well as we often talk about them as a risk. But I think actually we need to look at these as potentially an asset. And one of the things that sea power enables you to do is control the global commons, and the global commons is part of the communications infrastructure. And I think in some ways we need to shift some of the narratives around cables. And so I'm kind of making bits of that argument there. So hopefully that'll be out soon.
Great. Well, I look forward to that. And for those of you that aren't Australian, for Australian defence spending, we are at about 2.03% of our gross domestic product, and there's debate about how high that should go. Now, actually, on to more maritime things, and I'm very excited about your subsea cable piece. To be honest, I see lots of things written about subsea cables that are not great in Australia, so I'm sure yours will be fantastic, and we'll share a link.
Dear,
Um,
that's a worry.
I won't delve into whose pieces I think are not great, but I see a lot of things where I'm like, okay, you don't quite understand how difficult it is to actually attack a subsea cable when it is thousands of meters deep. People seem to forget how difficult it is to operate in the water column. But anyway, moving on to what's happening in the region. Pacific. There's some stuff happening in the Pacific. So Australia. The Royal Australian Navy has a number of what are called Australian defence vessels. So these are not technically naval vessels, they're civilian vessels, civilian crewed, and supplemented with generally a naval liaison officer and a couple of other people. So the Australian Navy technically has quite a number of these because we call our patrol boats Australian defence vessels, but really in terms of the auxiliary support vessels, we have about 4 of these. Now, one of them is called ADV Reliant, and ADV Reliant is actually deployed for her second deployment to the Pacific. And I thought this was a really interesting thing. We don't often talk about Australia's Pacific support vessel. In 2020, in our force structure plan, it talked about the need to have a larger vessel that can support the Pacific Islands, whether it's humanitarian disaster relief, whether it's moving equipment around, kind of whatever they need. In fact, ADV Reliant, during its last deployment to the Pacific, actually did some hydrographic surveying in port. So it's a pretty multi-role vessel. So she has deployed to the Pacific. Again, I'm not sure how long their deployments are. I'm assuming they're kind of 3 to 6 months. In terms of the things that she's going to be doing, the reporting from the Australian Defence Force includes delivering humanitarian assistance and disaster relief stores to Fiji, some protective equipment to Tonga, to support Tonga's contribution in the upcoming exercise Talisman Sabre, which we'll get into a little bit more. But apparently it's going to be the biggest Talisman Sabre. I think that's the same thing in every press release for the last couple of Talisman Sabres, but it may well be. It doesn't mean it's not true. Reliance also delivering spares to Tuvalu as well to support the Australian Guardian class patrol program. The last time that we had a vessel in the Pacific, actually, Reliant was in the Pacific, and she actually delivered a bunch of fire trucks to Kiribati. So, look, I think this is a great capability that the Australian Defence Force has in terms of its Pacific support vessel. I thought it was interesting too. I had a piece out a couple of years ago talking about the need for a Royal Fleet Auxiliary or equivalent in the Australian Defence Force, and that was really talking about expanding the types of auxiliary vessels that we would need in the event of a crisis or conflict, crewing them with civilian crews, but having them as part of the Navy. And so when you think about the Royal Australian Navy structure at the moment, it currently has 2 replenishment vessels, but unlike the US and unlike the UK, these are fully crewed by Royal Australian Navy sailors and officers. And I think their crew, I might get it wrong, is in the order of magnitude of about 150. In a previous life, I was second in command of a tanker. Its crew is in the order of magnitude of about 200 people. And I think realistically, that's kind of a waste of use of sailors at sea when you could crew it with a lot less civilians. So anyway, ADV Reliant is in the Pacific. Any comments on that? Pacific support vessels, Reliant, Royal Fleet auxiliaries?
No, I think it's clear it's a really useful role, and I think presence matters, and the right kind of presence matters. And in some ways, this is a more useful capability in certain ways, or a sort of a parallel capability to sending a kind of a warship, a significant warship out into the Pacific. It sends different signals. It's a different kind of engagement, and I think there's real value in that. And we've only got to look at the challenges I think that are going to be in this region in terms of Australia needing to step up if the United States is pulling back across the broader region. That this kind of thing is the sort of thing that needs to happen, and probably needs to happen a little bit more. To your point, I was looking through the notes you've made on this, and I was shocked by the fact that in 2024 Reliant was crewed by a civilian crew of 18. The obviously we know civilian vessels have smaller crews, but the difference in scale of kind of magnitude of crew between the AORs, the replenishment vessels, and something like this is really quite remarkable. And so in terms of effective use of resources, that seems like there is a lot to be gained by going down this kind of model.
So I agree, and I often use the example, without labouring the point, HMAS Chules, which is an Australian Navy amphibious vessel. It was originally a Bay class ship that we brought from the UK. So the Royal Australian Navy crews it with about 150 officers and sailors, roughly. And I'm pretty sure, and I'm just trying to Google, but yeah, when it was crewed by the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, its crew was 60, right? And so there is this question about what kinds of vessels should be crewed by officers and sailors, what kinds of vessels should be crewed by civilians, and where can you save some of those crew numbers? Because, we know that the Royal Australian Navy has issues in terms of crewing ships at sea, or at least has historically had issues in terms of crewing ships at sea. And so I think that this is something to think about in terms of the structure in the future. Something else has come out in the press, which I think is interesting as well, kind of related to the Pacific, which is Lombrum Naval Base. Lombrum Naval Base is a naval base on Manus Island. It is a naval base that belongs to the Papua New Guinea Defence Force. Since about 2020, the US and Australia have been working with the Papua New Guinea Defence Force to upgrade this naval base, enhancing things like the electrical generation services, water and sewage, all of that boring kind of stuff. But it is a really important location. It is where the PNG Defence Force base their Guardian-class patrol boats. And actually, historically for Australia, it is quite significant. So prior to Papua New Guinea's independence, this was actually an Australian naval base. So it was built by the US Navy, by the Seabees during World War II, I think about 1944. In the 50s, it became an Australian Navy base. It was developed. It became HMAS Seidler, and then renamed HMAS Turangao. It was effectively used for, I think we only had one ship based out of there, but it was used for resupplying, refueling ships that were going up to the South China Sea or up top, as we've talked about before. Now, it was handed back to Papua New Guinea in about 1974-ish. I might be wrong. It might be a bit earlier, but in preparation for Papua New Guinea's independence. I think it is really interesting. It doesn't make the news a lot in Australia. We don't talk about it very much, but it is a very strategically important base. It's important that it is a trilateral cooperation between the US, PNG, and Australia to upgrade that base. And it also comes on the back of a renewed defence agreement between the US and Papua New Guinea, a bilateral security agreement between the US and Australia in 2023, and negotiations which started in February this year for an upgraded defence pact between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Richard, did I get my history wrong? You're going to be appalled.
No, I think you're pretty much spot on. And I think it's as you say, it's strategically a really important kind of location. And if you look at Australian defence planning, certainly through the kind of later 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, it is a key element of the ability of Australia to project power forward from kind of southern Australia, which is where the majority of kind of naval bases, etc., are, into what was then kind of the forward defence area of Southeast Asia. So this has always been part of that kind of narrative, or part of that planning process. And I think actually, if you look at a lot of what is being talked about now, and I was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, talking about the archipelago and littoral manoeuvre and all of these sorts of things, actually engaging with places like PNG and being able to potentially operate from places like this in time of sort of high tension or potentially even conflict. This is exactly what Australia actually needs to do, and is the kind of the quiet underpinnings of a lot of the more explicit strategic statements that are being made. I do think there's also something quite interesting about the sudden way that Australia really jumped on this after the US PNG deal, and I suspect, and I don't know of the details, but I suspect there's been a slight frisson of concern in Canberra about whether or not the United States was kind of jumping a little bit ahead in terms of engagement with PNG, but wanting absolutely to make sure that Australia was front and centre in this kind of relationship as well.
I really agree with your point on forward basing. In the talk I gave last night about maritime strategy, I reread a publication I'd written in 2023 where I actually talked about one of our elements needs to be the ability to forward base our ships and also rethink. You're much better at history than me, but it strikes me as crazy that the base structure for the Royal Australian Navy is largely descendant from the Henderson Plan, which was put out well over 100 years ago with a different view of how the Navy would operate. And the view at the time was that the role of the Royal Australian Navy would be really just to kind of hold off any forces until the Royal Navy came over the horizon. And in fact, the basing to the southern part of Australia was about, okay, well, we don't really care about Northern Australia. I'm deeply paraphrasing. This is not how Admiral Henderson or Captain Henderson, whatever his name was, wrote this, but we don't really care about Northern Australia, which is very different to our rhetoric now. We don't really care about Northern Australia. If they lodge some forces there, fine, they're not going to get anyway. Then we'll send the Navy around from the south. We'll deal with them and the Royal Navy come over the horizon. So I think there's a bit of a structural problem in our maritime strategy. I did put out a piece in the Fin Review last year, which didn't get a lot of support, talking about basing an Anzac-class frigate out of Singapore, for example. So anyway, forward basing. But we should move on because we did say we needed to be tight on time today, and we are going on about this. So what else is happening in the region, Richard? HMAS Sydney's doing stuff.
So HMAS Sydney, we talked about HMAS Sydney's regional presence deployment before. It's been busy by all accounts, conducting and I know how much you love this, maritime cooperative activity in the Philippines.
It's a multilateral cooperative activity. Get it right. There's two ends.
I am sorry.
Wow.
I've made a dreadful faux pas there. This was with both the Philippines and United States forces. This is apparently it's the 9th, and I must say I had not been keeping track. MMCA that's been conducted in South China Sea or West Philippine Sea. It was, as I say, conducted inside the EEZ and with both Philippine vessels and American aircraft. So this is something that is separate too, but taking place very close to Exercise Balakatan, which is the very large, primarily US-Philippines joint exercise, which is taking place at the moment, and in which Australia is also participating. And we might come on and talk a little bit about that in a second. Sydney has also been doing training with the Royal New Zealand Air Force. So there's a Royal New Zealand Air Force P8, which has been operating as part of the sanctions enforcement. So we talked again about Operation Argos, which is the Australian contribution to sanctions enforcement against North Korea. This is the New Zealand contribution to it. So the New Zealanders had been sending up a P8, and that had been conducting sanctions patrols similar to what Australian aircraft do. And whilst sort of en route, Sydney conducted training exercises with the P8 and USS Omaha. And so that was part of that kind of wider suite of engagement that was taking place. So lots and lots going on. Sounds like quite a busy kind of regional presence deployment, and it'll be interesting to see what they're up to next.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting some of the media releases that are coming out about this. So, look, Australia has been deploying ships to the South China Sea for a very, very long time. longer than we've been alive. But and when deploying ships to the South China Sea, conducting multilateral and bilateral exercises with the countries around the region. I mean, that has really been the focus for decades. But it's interesting now that this is really being pushed in media releases, etc. I think that's not something that I saw before. You used to deploy for a Southeast Asia deployment. You'd come back, nobody had any idea what you'd been doing. Now there is a lot of media being pushed out, a lot of press releases from the navies that are doing these things, including the Australian Navy and the Australian Defence Force. And I think there is a real point behind that in terms of strategic comms of trying to message that, hey, we're not alone up here in Southeast Asia. We are welcomed by the coastal states. And actually, there is concern whether these coastal states want to highlight it or not. There is concern about China's activities. So I think that there's some interesting messaging in terms of the strategic communications that this is now being pushed out. Something else happened in the South China Sea in the last week. Some interesting imagery. Richard, do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely. So this, I think, in many ways segues quite nicely off exactly that kind of comment about strategic communications. So I think it originally came out in an article in the Financial Times, London Financial Times, about a week or so ago now, and this was. They got information from a source inside the Philippines. But what had happened was in some point in the middle of April, and we don't know explicitly when, the Chinese Coast Guard, by their own account, chased some Philippine fishermen away from a sandbank in the Spratly Islands in the middle of the South China Sea. And doing what they described as enforcing maritime management and exercising sovereign jurisdiction, to use the Chinese language there. And one of the things that they did was they landed, I think, 6 or 7 Coast Guard personnel on this sandbank called Sandy Cay, and they held out a Chinese flag and took a whole load of pictures of it. And this landed in Western media, and there was a lot of discussion around it, and particularly the language that was used was that the Chinese had seized this sandbank. And then shortly after this became public, you had statements from sort of quite forward-leaning or aggressive statements from Chinese state media. But then thereafter, you had the Philippines, almost immediately after it became public, decided that they then needed to respond. And so you saw a joint operation by Philippines Navy, Philippines Coast Guard, and Philippines National Police, in which they then went from a base very nearby, which is Thitu Island, to Sandy Cay, and they again landed on Sandy Cay, held out a Philippine flag, and took some pictures of that and put that up on social media, again making similar kind of claims about sovereignty of the island. I think there was quite a lot of discussion of this, a lot of talk about whether or not the Chinese had sort of claimed sovereignty over this, or, as I say, seized this. I think it's in many ways a bit of a storm in a teacup, in the regard that China has for a long time claimed sovereignty over all of the Spratly Islands, as has the Philippines, as has Vietnam. So this is a dispute. That dispute hasn't really changed as far as I can see, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'll hear what you've got to say in a second. But I don't think that's actually changed a lot on the ground. And notably, I think the initial concern was that this was the Chinese effectively occupying this and then potentially using Sandy Cay to build out and potentially possibly build an artificial island similar to what they've done on Subi Reef, which is very close by. There is absolutely no sign of that, and the Philippine photographs clearly show that there's no Chinese presence there, although in the background there was a very large Chinese Coast Guard cutter watching what was going on. So as far as I see, this is a kind of another tit for tat. I think there's some quite interesting questions about why it was released, why it came out now. It seems probable that this has something to do with responses to exercise Bala Katan.
Yep.
Would seem like the logical thing. the one question that does give me a little bit of pause for concern within this is whether or not this is the first step in which China is viewing the current wider strategic environment as a suitable moment to begin to push and test some of these alliance relationships and see, well, okay, what does the United States do if we begin to push in some of these sorts of ways? Because there obviously have been real questions amongst American allies around the region about the level of support that they're likely to get, and whether or not the Chinese see this as a kind of a window of opportunity.
Yeah, I think your latter point is definitely the most important discussion point around this. There was a lot of flurry of activity saying now China's salami sliced and occupied another piece, but it's just this. I mean, that's just not the case. The claim hasn't changed. The claim is still there. They clearly haven't occupied Sandy Cay. But I agree with you. I think that Pete Hegseth's visit about a month ago to the region helped in terms of making clear that the current US administration is focused on the Indo-Pacific. At least in commentary, there is some question about the numbers of Patriot and THAAD missile systems that have been moved from the Indo-Pacific to the Middle East in the last month. But I think that the wording around that was helpful. But still, I mean, there is a real question whether China sees this instability as an opportunity to push. And certainly I've always taken the view when people talk about will China decide to invade Taiwan, which I'm not suggesting is about to happen, but I've always taken the view that it was conditions based, and one of these conditions is if they think that US resolve is wavering, right? And so I think this will be a really interesting period of next 6 months to see what else we see from the US administration about focus on the Indo-Pacific, whether there is a movement of assets. There needs to be something more than just kind of stronger statements. Of course, Exercise Balakatan is a demonstration, but we've been seeing that for a little while. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting period. Moving on from Sandy Cay, there's just one more, and we are running out of time as standard. One more thing about the South China Sea, which I thought was interesting, and it's come up a little bit, which is the idea of maritime security cooperation between Indonesia and China. So if we go back to last year, after President Prabowo of Indonesia was inaugurated, the first country he visited was China. The second was actually Russia, and the third was Australia, I think. But we won't delve into that. That's also taking up a bit of our election. But at the time that he visited China, I think it was November. No, I'm getting he went back to China in November last year. Second visit, I think. I might be getting my times mixed up. But anyway, in November last year, during what I think was the second visit, he seemed to endorse a communique which summarised that visit that was pushed out from China, which talked about territorial disputes and seemed to support China's position on the 9-dash line. Now, this got a lot of press. One, Indonesia's position has kind of always been that they are not part of the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, although they very clearly have an overlapping area in the North China Sea with the 9-dash line. And in fact, last year we saw that flare up a little bit with Chinese Coast Guard vessels harassing survey vessels within that area and the Indonesian Coast Guard chasing them out, not only chasing them out, releasing footage of that to the media. But there was concern that the communique in November indicated a closeness on maritime issues or a willingness of Indonesia to align with China on this point. Now, the Indonesian Department of Foreign Affairs equivalent came out very quickly and said that's not the case. We don't support China's 9-dash line, etc., etc. But that has kind of raised some eyebrows. Now, in April, there was a meeting between China and Indonesia with their equivalents of their defense ministers and their foreign affairs ministers. And in the communications about that meeting, they agreed to work on maritime security. Now, again, some points are being made about this of exactly how close are Indonesia and China becoming on maritime security. My kind of take on it is that, to be honest, in this region, the Indo-Pacific, specifically in Southeast Asia, whenever there is a communique that involves foreign ministers and defense ministers from any country, maritime security generally tends to be one of the throwaway lines in there. And I'm not trying to diminish it, but I think that that's got to be acknowledged as well. Now, whether they actually intend to work on it or not, I think is a completely different question. I think it would be challenging for them to do so because of China's actions in the North China Sea and how that actually impacts Indonesia. Now, it is a difficult position for Indonesia because China is Indonesia's largest trading partner. And Indonesia, in fact, President Prabowo, following his election, was very clear to say that economic development is his number one priority, and he sees China as an opportunity for that. So, look, I just thought this was interesting. I don't think too much of it. Somebody came up to me last night and said, "Are you worried about this cooperation? You know, you could see Chinese frigates sitting in the Indonesian territorial waters off the Malacca Strait." I don't think that's likely to be the case. But what's your take on it, Richard?
Yeah, I think, as you say, I think it's a kind of a watching brief. I guess my broader take would be to once again reinforce the point, which I think occasionally gets lost in a lot of, particularly the Australian narrative, and to a lesser extent the American narrative around this, which is that countries, Indonesia most notably, but lots of the countries in Southeast Asia, are very keen not to pick sides in this, right? And we often assume that because there are these kind of territorial disputes or maritime boundary disputes, that they are very much in our camp and not the Chinese one. And I think that is a deeply questionable way to look at this. And I think in certain regards, if you look at what China does in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific, is it surprising that a large archipelagic state is looking to at least have some kind of engagement with the country that has the largest offshore fishing fleet, the largest coast guard, one of the largest navies in the region? This is the world in which we live. Now, whether or not we're going to see Chinese frigates parked in Indonesian territorial waters in the next year or so, I think is probably unlikely. But engagement with China for these states is something that they're going to have to do. It's just a reality of the situation on the ground. And I think we're going to have to work out how to manage that rather than throw all our toys out of the pram in a way that seems to currently be the approach whenever Indonesia talks to anyone that isn't either Australia or the United States.
Yeah, I agree. And I think taking that a step further, it's something that Australia is going to have to grapple with and manage in terms of its own engagement with China. And there was a piece out in Loe's The Interpreter this week. We won't delve into it, but it talked about the fact that Australia and China should be having reciprocal naval port visits. Now, I certainly don't support that. I don't think our relationship is there. And I think that whilst the PLA still puts at risk the women and men of the ADF when they operate in the South China Sea, that is not appropriate. But I do think that it is part of a wider conversation of, yes, China is aggressive in the region. Yes, Australia should be deeply concerned about a lot of China's behaviour in the region, not only in the maritime domain, but also in the space and cyber domains. But more broadly, China is also a major player in this region, a key economic partner of Australia and others, and we do need to navigate a way of not accepting that behaviour and preparing for concerns about China, but also not completely isolating them. And, I think it's been pleasing to see in the last 12 months that it might be 18 months, the reinitiation of high-level military-to-military dialogues between China and the US and China and Australia. But we could talk about that. That's a whole new podcast episode. One other thing that we should probably mention before we get on to capability, and we will need to wrap this up soon, Talisman Sabre is coming up this year. So exercise Talisman Sabre is a major bilateral exercise. The press release out from the Australian Department of Defence says that this is the 11th iteration. It says it's going to be the largest Talisman Sabre ever. Great. That's been in every press release the last 2 years. May well be true. Talisman Sabre itself is really, well, they still call it a bilateral exercise between the US and Australia, and it really was a bilateral exercise between the US and Australia, historically, where it was focused very much on interoperability and high-end warfighting. Occasionally, depending on the relationship between the US and New Zealand, occasionally New Zealand also participated as well. But it has really opened up over the last couple of iterations with lots of countries participating. So I'm not sure you can really call it bilateral. I mean, the planning is bilateral, but the execution is certainly not. This iteration says it's going to have over 30,000 military personnel from 19 nations, not bilateral, set to participate, including, so it's normally conducted over the north of Australia, focus often on Queensland, but this iteration will actually have some serials and some components of the exercise conducted in Papua New Guinea, which is interesting. The countries participating that's being released at the moment: Canada, Fiji, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, which is interesting. I think
Part of
that's
the
the
carrier
Norwegian
strike group.
frigates that's escorting the carrier strike group from the UK. Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Tonga, and the United Kingdom. So that is a lot of countries. And so I think this is great. It's going to be in July, 13th of July to the 4th of August. I'm certain we'll see a non-official participation, which will be a Chinese spy ship, actual spy ship, not the thing we alleged to be a spy ship in the last couple of weeks, that'll come down too.
So, just very quickly, I think the engagement inside PNG is really interesting. I also think that there's something really useful here in terms of the defense diplomacy element of this, in terms of, for lots of these countries, particularly I'm thinking about places like Japan, or particularly Singapore, the ability to have the space to operate and conduct major exercises, testing of missiles, all sorts of other things that you have seen in Talisman Sabre before, and I suspect we'll see again. Australia, and I'm not only really talking about Talisman Sabre here, but offers there's something in terms of defence diplomacy and engagement that Australia can offer that very few countries can, in terms of the ability to conduct these kind of exercises in our sort of large geographic space. And I think that that's something that there's real value to. Whether or not we'll see a whole different raft of exercises sort of from the relatively sort of low end or low capability type things all the way through up until to sort of very high end warfare exercises, I think is also something that will be interesting to watch, particularly as this exercise just continues to grow and grow.
Yeah, I agree, and I think this is a great direction for this exercise. To be honest, I think if I was to talk about Australia's, the effective execution of Australia's military strategy and maritime strategy, I would say that its regional engagement in the last couple of years has been a real strong point in the expansion of both Australian multilateral exercises and contribution to other multilateral exercises. I think is something that deserves a big tick in terms of progress. Now, we are very short on time, so just quickly moving into capability developments. There have been a number of capability developments around the region. We won't have time to cover them all. North Korea has launched what they're calling is a destroyer. It's estimated to be between 3 and 5,000 tons. It's about 143 meters long. At least that's what CIS said when they picked it up in December last year. It is interesting in terms of the largest, most capable ship that they have launched, and it really does highlight kind of a blue water focus potentially for the North Korean Navy, which we haven't necessarily seen before. But it's hard to really differentiate between the rhetoric and what's actually happening. That said, very quickly after it being commissioned, not launched, it undertook a missile firing. So it certainly has some degree of capability. Other things happening in the region in capability. There is an AUKUS Maritime Innovation Challenge, which is looking at underwater C2 and underwater communications, which I think is great. That's certainly one of the limitations in terms of the effective use of uncrewed underwater vehicles. So that's happening. We'll put links to some of these in the show, by the way, because we're going to go through them fairly quickly. The French have released footage of them using a one-way attack uncrewed surface vessel to blow up a ship, which I think is interesting. This is the capability we've seen in the Black Sea, also in the Red Sea, but to a great effect in the Black Sea, used by the Ukrainians, now finding its way to more conventional navies. And then finally, Indonesia has been talking about SOSUS seabed arrays, and we might delve into that in a little bit more detail because it's probably the one we do need to cover. I've quickly run through some of those developments. So I think, I've gone through that very, very quickly. And as I said, we will put some links to these things in the show notes if you're interested in what's happening with these capability developments. But we are seeing some clear trends here around the region, which is one, Navy is investing in greater blue water naval capability. So in both Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, with the exceptions of a couple of countries, the focus has really always been on brown water, green water naval capability. So I think this is an interesting trend. It's not just North Korea, but it is significant that North Korea is going down that path. Also, every show now we're talking about new uncrewed surface vessel capabilities that are being announced and demonstrated. And so I think that the French one really ties into that theme, and navies are clearly trying to work out how they can integrate these capabilities. I'm still a little bit skeptical. And then with the AUKUS Maritime Innovation Challenge, look, I think that is a really important focus. It's the second innovation challenge under AUKUS Pillar 2. The first one occurred last year, focused on electronic warfare. I think cracking underwater communications, I don't know how much you can crack it, I mean, physics, but still, looking at that is an important focus, right? One of the clear limitations of all of these new capabilities that are coming out, UUVs and seabed sensors, etc., is the ability to actually use the data collected from them, and that relies on communication. Now, speaking of seabed sensors, what I want to talk about a little bit more was an interesting report that came out of Indonesia. It was actually captured in Naval News, and it talked about Indonesia considering a SOSUS-like system. Now, SOSUS, now called IUSS, was a seabed, or is a seabed array system developed by the US during the Cold War to track Russian submarines. Now, it is really the placement of passive acoustic sensors in critical acoustic positions, generally around kind of continental shelves and things like that, things where you're going to get long-range passive transmissions. So Indonesia, the Chief of Staff of the Indonesian military recently testified at a parliamentary hearing and talked about this being one of their key goals. He has also said that the proposal has been submitted to the Ministry of Defence and has received presidential backing, which is no surprise when you think about President Prabowo's background. Now, what exactly are they talking about in terms of the capability? It's not clear. But it's clear in the commentary around it that Indonesia has a concern about the fact that they don't have situational awareness in the underwater domain within their archipelago. Now, when we talk about submarines transiting, a submarine, in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, must transit on the surface if it is going through a territorial sea. However, an archipelagic sea lane, which we won't delve into, right? An archipelagic sea lane, which is what is generally the transit routes through through Indonesia, the acknowledged archipelagic sea lanes. You don't have to transit on the surface. A submarine can transit in its normal mode, which is submerged. So Indonesia is clearly concerned about their lack of situational awareness on this, and it probably, comes on the back of the comments from the Indonesian Foreign Minister in 2021 about AUKUS and Australian nuclear-powered submarines transiting through the archipelago. Now, the relationship has moved on since then. Indonesia is not so against AUKUS. Australia's done a lot of work to explain it. But this is interesting, the acknowledgement of Indonesia about that concern, about the lack of underwater domain awareness. It also probably comes on the back of the number of UUVs that keep popping up on Indonesia's coast from Chinese origin. Now, one of the challenges is a seabed array system like SOSUS is incredibly expensive, and Indonesia has announced a number of capabilities that they are interested in, including the aircraft carrier in the last 12 months, but they still only spend 1% of gross domestic product on their military capabilities, and most of that goes to the army. So I'm not sure this is a feasible acquisition, but interesting. Richard, any comments on that?
No, I'm not. As you say, it chimes very much with a lot of the discussion that's come out of Indonesia, from the AUKUS discussion to other narratives around, again, this sense of being in the middle of potentially a conflict zone, with sort of China to the north, Australia and US-based forces in Australia to the south, the ability to, know what's going on, but also to try and deter and prevent Indonesia in a perfectly reasonable way from becoming effectively a battleground, whether in a period of competition or conflict between those two powers, is something that has been a clear narrative for a while, and I think this fits very clearly into that. Picking up on the capability side of things, just very quickly, this is not something that is yet set in stone, but the US defense bill is something that I think many people have been watching quite closely to try and get a grasp on what's going on in terms of wider American focus in terms of foreign policy, spending, etc. There's been a reconciliation bill, so this is coming from both the House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services committees, where basically they're going to looking to throw a whole load more money at defence. Now, whether this gets through the rest of the Republican Party, I think, is still up for significant doubts. But you've got some interesting indications as to where they're putting money. Shipbuilding is the single biggest focus in this. Sort of talking about $34 billion for shipbuilding, including additional money for another Virginia-class submarine, and a whole load of money on small landing craft. So this chimes quite closely with some of what Australia has been doing. Additional money on nuclear deterrence, and picking up again on what you were talking about before about USVs, there is more money for uncrewed capabilities, but in this case, the Americans, at least within this, are looking to focus on medium and small uncrewed vessels, and notably, there's no mention that I've seen of the large uncrewed surface vessel, which was the focus of quite a lot of attention, and of course is also supposedly the basis of Australia's large optionally crewed surface vessel, which is a key part of the Australian Surface Fleet Review of a year or so ago. So some really interesting trends there, and I think that highlights once again the fact that this is a space where everyone knows it's important, but nobody yet quite knows what the answers are, and I think we need to be careful about jumping to too many conclusions.
Unfortunately, we are at time. We didn't talk about the saga that is Australian tugs built in China, which is just a complete beat up. Richard, I guess that's all. And I guess, we have to say that this is corny as hell, but maritime matters.
Absolutely. Good to chat.